I need to make sure I'm recording this time because I forgot to do it on my last program. All right. Let me share. All right. I think everybody can see my slides, right, that are online.
Yep, got them.
All right. Very good. All right. Well, good evening to everyone here live at the Fusion virtually. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and I am the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. And this is our 12th annual Veterans Tribute presentation. So thank you for coming this evening or participating virtually. Again, this is our organization. We've been in existence for 15 years. And we are an organization dedicated to preserving the contributions that current and former residents of southeastern Pennsylvania and nearby regions made towards protecting the United States during the Cold War. And our event here live in Warminster is in the lab this evening. And for those of you who may need restrooms, they are located, if you exit the lab, turn left, and they're down on the right. If you end up in the marble floor, you've gone too far, turn around, and you'll see the restrooms right in front of you on the right. If you are, or no, on your left, if you end up at the marble walkway. I'm hoping next month to announce some activities that we'll be doing to celebrate America 250 next year. So stay tuned for that. So more information to come. And also, as many of you know, we do record our webinars, and I remember to record this event this evening, and we do maintain these on our YouTube channel, which is listed under the same name as our organization. I do try to keep that site updated with other Cold War related information, so it is worthwhile periodically popping on there to check that out. But if you happen to miss one of our programs, definitely check it out on YouTube, and you can watch it on demand. We also maintain a website on a social media site on Facebook. And recently, we also have a fledgling presence on another site called MeWe. So if you use that site at all, we also have a small social site on there that's actually listed under the Naval Air Development Center, actually not under my organization, but you'll see our logo with posts on that site. Also, just wanted to mention that, we do have a display room dedicated to Naval Air Development Center history located in the front of the Fuge building. We will be making adding a new display in 2026, more to come on that. But I've just started some work on that. So once that's further along, we'll communicate some details on that as well. And as a reminder, we did recently send out a notification regarding our 2026 live and webinar programming. So this is the program list for 2026. Looking forward to this very much. It is a mix of live and webinar programming, as we have been doing for the last couple of years. And being that this is a veterans event today, I did also want to remind folks that we do maintain a separate site called southeastpennsylvaniaveterans.com. Believe it or not, there isn't a website to basically commemorate Southeastern Pennsylvania veterans. So during the pandemic, we actually created this website to begin collecting veterans information. So we do from, I believe his name is Jim McComb, we uploaded a bunch of information on Medal of Honor recipients on there, which is very interesting to look at. And actually, I recently learned that the Newtown Historical Society has a whole collection of Newtown residents that are veterans, mostly from World War II, and we're hoping to be able to duplicate that information on this website as well. So they'll have a digital presence as well. So that's something that is in process. But if you are a veteran from southeastern Pennsylvania, either born here or came to reside here, we'd love to add your biographical information to this site. So definitely check it out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at mail@coldwarhistory.org. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker this evening. And I think you will enjoy this as something a little bit different in terms of local history, and also someone who made a very significant contribution to local history, as well as contributions to supporting primarily World War II and some of the and activities after that. But I'd like to introduce Arthur Liese. Now, Arthur is actually the son of the gentleman that we're going to be talking a bit about this evening. But Arthur is the president and managing director of the Sports Gallery and Bookshop Incorporated, which was founded in 1933 in New York, and it's the oldest gallery of this unique specialty in this country. And Arthur is the leading expert on 20th century American sporting art during the golden era of sport, which was 1927 to 1941. He's also an appraiser and well-published author and lecturer on this specialty subject. And Arthur is also a licensed pilot and has a deep appreciation for aviation history, which was inspired by his father, Henry A. Liese's own personal and professional aviation interests that inspired his later engineering and pioneering manufacturing work in aviation. Airplanes and flight had fascinated Henry since his youth on Long Island, watching airplanes take off, including Charles Lindbergh, believe it or not, and landings at Roosevelt Field. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Arthur, and I'm going to switch our webcam around so you can see him. And we will also be showing some slides as well. So welcome, Arthur.
Okay. Well, Eleanor, thank you very much for this very kind and generous invitation. And I think it's particularly okay. Is okay. I wasn't holding it high enough. So I'll start again. Well, Eleanor, thank you again. This is a very significant. Okay. Can you hear me without the mic?
No, I definitely need the mic on Zoom. Yeah, we need the mic for Zoom.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, the PA is not as loud as when you were talking.
I don't know. Can you tap it to see if it's loud?
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you for your technical assistance. So again, Eleanor, thank you again. This is a very important invitation, and it's an ironic one. Here in this building, some very significant events in aviation history in this country took place, and they connect to very directly to my father's old company. And so, you know, in law school, they teach lawyers to start a case by giving an opening statement. And so I'm going to move forward with an opening statement and an introduction tonight. And so the story of aviation is a story of dreams. It's a story of people, passion, emotion, and adventure. And this is the story of Lavelle Aircraft in Newtown, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And the first story is really a story that I grew up with. My father grew up on Long Island in Mineola, a bicycle ride from Roosevelt Field. And he was born in 1914. And as soon as he could ride his bicycle, he used to go over to Roosevelt Field every afternoon and watch these planes land and take off. And if you could imagine the irony of what was going on at Roosevelt Field at the time, you had this growing concept of aviation. There are biplanes and some monoplanes landing there. And there were also horse-drawn vehicles. In fact, there were two forms of gas delivery at Roosevelt Field. In the early 20s, they were horse-drawn vehicles with tanks on them, and that's how they fueled the planes up. So, I mean, think of the contrast. You've got a team of horses, draft horses, pulling these aviation fuel tanks and then fueling up these planes, and then the horses go away. And then eventually the horses went away, and some very crude-looking trucks came, and that's the way they continued to deliver fuel. But that was an important contrast. And my father was just captivated by this concept of airplanes from the time he was a kid until the day he died. I mean, he literally never lost the excitement, the emotion, or the fantasy of flying. In fact, in one of the newspaper articles, he was quoted as saying that, gee, I've been in this business all my life, and I came down here from Long Island with a lot of dreams, and some of them actually came true. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of those dreams that came true tonight. And so again, on this picture, if you can conceive this picture, this is my father on the right, and the man on the left is Joseph Burt. And Joe Burt lived in Mineola, and he was a photographer. And Joe is an interesting guy. He chronicled the daily activities of Roosevelt Field from 1909 until well into the 30s. And so he has an incredible history of these photographic documentation of all these unusual planes. And Dad used to work there, as I said, after school, and he got to know Joe, and he would help Joe, and then he'd help somebody in a hangar. So he just hung around that field every opportunity that he got. And he knew that's what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. And so that friendship with Joe Burt built over time. And then Dad would call up Joe and say, gee, can I have a copy of this picture or that picture? And in the beginning, all of Joe's pictures were taken by an 8x10 Graflex with glass slides. And so, and then as the photography game advanced, the glass slides went away and celluloid slides came. And so over Joe's curious, his history and career, he took almost 1,000 significant photographs of the activities at Roosevelt Field. And then when Joe got old, he called up my father one day and said, listen, nobody wants my slides. And there's a museum on Long Island in Mineola called the Cradle of Aviation. And it's a complicated story. It took a long time to get going. There were a lot of politics up there. There was a lot of money on Long Island, and different benefactors were reluctant to contribute funding to get this thing going because of the politics involved. You know, one donor said, well, look, I'll do this, but I don't want this guy on the board. And so that kind of infighting developed, and it took a long time for this thing to get going. And so Joe called up Dad one day and said, you know, I'm really getting old. I'm in my 90s now, and do you have any interest in my slides? Dad said, well, of course. And Joe said, well, I'll call you up and we'll get together on these things. And so a little time went by, a couple of months went by, and then all of a sudden Dad got a call from Joe's daughter, and his daughter announced that her father had died. And she asked Dad if he was still interested in these slides and if he'd come up, and they'd negotiate a deal, and Dad would get to buy them. And that all came together. Contract was consummated. Dad bought the slides. And those slides gave him probably the greatest pleasure that I could ever imagine. And as I was growing up, kids were learning about baseball and things like that. And I was learning about airplanes. And every time one of these, Dad would be going through one of these slides and labeling it, telling what that particular event was, he'd tell the story. And it was just fascinating for me as a kid. And then we go down to the plant in Newtown, and the factory was called, Daddy called it the plant. Let's go down to the plant. And Saturday mornings, we'd go down there. And I'd go up into the end. He'd take me up into the engineering department, and he'd show me some plans. And he said, "No, I want you to look at this, and then we're going to go down to the machine shop and see if you can figure out what they're actually working on." So I'd get this blueprints in my mind and go down to the machine shop. That's where the tool and die workers were working. And I'd pick out the tools that they were working at. And that was one of the adventures that I enjoyed on Saturday morning with my father. And so over time, that's how my interest built up in this stuff. And the every one of those little adventures brought back some historical event at Roosevelt Field. And we go back to our home in Yardley, and Dad would take out a slide and he'd show me and say, "Well, look, this is what the way we started out." And so the thrust of the story in the terms of the manufacturing of these planes construction and wooden spars and wooden ribs and wings to metal ribs and wings. And that was the whole focus of Fleet Wings. Fleet Wings was started in 1929 by a man whose name was Carl Deganol. And Carl was a brilliant guy. He was an MIT graduate. He was a mechanical engineer. And his family, his father was a partner with J.D. Rockefeller in the oil business. And at one point, Carl's father, his name was Frank Deganol, had a falling out with Rockefeller. And he left, started his own company. And Carl wanted to start his own business at the time, and his father said, "Look, I'll finance your business. And with one caveat, the business has to make money at the time that I die, or the business gets sold or it gets liquidated." And so Carl's just was a brilliant guy that had all these research ideas, and he had a father with unlimited wealth that was funding all this. So it was a very unique opportunity. And about that, in the late 20s, just in 1930, U.S. Steel came out with a new product called stainless steel. The aircraft industry knew about aluminum a little bit. They knew how to work it. They knew how to form it. They knew how to cut it, shape it, bend it, spin it. But nobody really understood how to work with stainless steel. They didn't know how to bend it, what the bending properties were. They didn't know how to weld it, and how to strengthen it by heat treating. And so that's what what Fleet Wings specialized in. And their first product was this plane called the F-101. And that plane had a stainless steel wing. There's the wing right there being fabricated in the hangar at Roosevelt Field. And so all those ribs were spot welded, and then they were spot welded to they had these all these ribs heat treated, and when the truck came back from the factory in Ohio where these things were heat treated, all these parts were rattling. And they opened the crate and couldn't figure out what the noise was. And it turns out that the heat treating made that stainless steel so brittle that it fractured. And so there were all these, these nicely formed ribs were all in a million pieces. So then they had to figure out the metallurgical properties of this stainless steel, because stainless steel comes in a laundry list of different alloys. And then they had to figure out the heat treating process. How long do you leave this stuff in the heat? What's the temperature? And what do you quell it with? Do you use water? Quench it. Thank you. And so they went through this process. And so finally they got this thing all together. And that They did the load testing, and the way they load tested the wing was literally to put sandbags on it and measured the amount of deflection. And then they started flying the plane and tested it. And I actually met the test pilot that was the guy that actually flew that plane. And he was talking to me about the details of spin testing it and how the plane was laterally unstable. And he had actually went into a flat spin at one point, and he just was able to recover it, but just by accident probably. And he discovered that the reason that the plane became laterally unstable was because of the shortness of the fuselage. And he decided that the fuselage had to be lengthened by 3 feet. So they brought it back into the shop, and they did that. Made that modification, and then they went out and flew this thing again, and that seemed to be just fine. And so the focus of the designs of planes at the time was on seaplanes. Consider that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. And it's hard to believe now, but in the 20s, there weren't airports all over the place. And the ones that were in existence were all grass or mud when it rained. And so seaplanes were really the focus of aviation and transportation at the time. And so Dad worked for Grover Loaning for a short period of time, and Carl worked for Loaning for a short period of time. And then they both decided that Grover wasn't the guy to stay with, because he just wasn't grasping the new materials and the aesthetic design that the plane should have. But Grover Loaning was focusing on seaplanes. And some of the young engineers that Grover had working for him at the time, one was Leroy Grumman, who ultimately left and started his own company, Grumman Aircraft and Engineering, out in Bethpage, Long Island. And so all these guys left, and they went in their own direction. And because the seaplanes were the focus of the era, Roosevelt Field wasn't a good place to stay. So they had to get close to water. And so in the late 30s, a little town on the Delaware River in Bucks County called Bristol, Pennsylvania, had a huge aircraft industry down there. And there was a company called Keystone Aviation that had a big manufacturing facility there. And they went out of business. And Degenol found out about it. He drove down from Long Island to look at this thing and started negotiating with the bankruptcy attorneys, and he bought the place. And the attraction to this was that it had its own factory that was huge. It had a huge hangar, and it had a ramp that went right down to the Delaware River. And so when I first saw some of the early slides that Dad had, I recognized the Loaning amphibians. They're just very awkward looking things. They had square vertical stabilizers, and they just, you couldn't imagine that they fly. They were so awkward looking. And ultimately, the wings of these Loaning planes were all wood. And so that was a story of disaster. And this plane that we're looking at right now is called the Douglas Dolphin. And the Douglas Dolphin was being flown by the Army and by the Coast Guard. And a very significant event happened at one point in the late 30s. Some of these dolphins were stationed in the Philippines. And as you know, that's a hot, humid climate. And the main spar in that plane was laminated wood. So the glue got frail, it got brittle, and it failed. And one day, one of the Army pilots was getting ready to take off, and he was doing his run-up, powering this thing up to 2,300 RPMs and cycling the props, and those engines pulled out of the engine mounts and went forward. And what happened was that the main spar had delaminated to the point that it failed. And so steel hulls, but the wood wings. And then at one point, somebody heard about Lavelle Aircraft, I'm sorry, Fleet Wings in Bristol, Pennsylvania. And they contacted Fleet Wings and said, look, we've got this problem. They walked through this whole thing, and they gave Fleet Wings a contract to design and refit these things with a stainless steel wing. And the reason that was important to Fleet Wings at the time was that Carl was designing this plane called the Seabird. And it was the first all stainless steel amphibian that was ever constructed in the world. Way ahead of Willie Messerschmitt, for example. Some of the employees that worked for Fleet Wings were German, and they had worked for Willie Messerschmitt. And they could see the politics changing in the 30s. These guys were craftsmen. They wanted to make airplanes. They didn't want to get involved in politics. So they came to this country. And some of these guys wound up at Roosevelt Field. And they started working with Degenol. And then when Degenol moved from Long Island down to Bristol, they followed him down. And so it was the Germans that worked on this wing, and that's the main wing there. You can see the jig that they've constructed to hold that thing, and that's the leading edge of it there. And you can see the massive strength that this has with all that reinforcement. And they were doing load testing, and you can see that the skin was corrugated. And they discovered that that corrugated skin gave that wing the greatest strength at that point. But they had to experiment with this thing. And this is something that these handful of engineers did at Fleet Wings. And I'm talking about a little company. I'm not talking about Boeing with hundreds and thousands of people. There were 4 engineers, 6 mechanics, tool and die makers, sheet metal guys, and machinists in the shop making this stuff. And when they needed some more people, some of their friends that came over from Germany and went to work here to be able to bring some of this technology, because the Germans were way ahead of the United States in this engineering of these planes at the time. And so these guys were all working for Willie Messerschmitt, and they came over here, brought that technology, and you're looking at it right now. This plane here was called the Seabird, and this is the first stainless steel amphibian that Carl designed. And this essentially was a refined design of a plane called the Loening Commuter. Grover Loening had an amphibian that was actually a biplane. And Carl looked at this thing and said, look, you don't need that top wing. And so he designed this plane and took that top wing off, powered it with a 300 horsepower Jacobs engine, and that fuselage is covered with stainless steel, and it's all spot welded. And when you spot weld the stainless steel to the longerons, it causes that deformation, and so it looks unattractive now, but up close to it, they put a jewelling on the stainless steel, so it was this jeweled surface that really hid all that stuff. And when you looked at it in the sun up close, I mean, it was really an attractive looking finish. And so the wing is all stainless steel, but it's covered in fabric, which was typical of the day because there was a weight and balance issue. And they decided that even though it was an amphibian, that they'd cover it with fabric as opposed to stainless steel. And so there were 7 of these Seabirds built. And again, there's the Seabird right on the river. The pilot flying that was Bill Engel, who was a legendary pilot in Bucks County. And he axing up that ramp there. And that's the Delaware River. There wasn't any marine traffic there. So the water was calm. There wasn't a lot of debris in it. And that was one of the problems that Loening had in the East River in New York. He would come out of his ramp, and then there was marine traffic, and there was a lot of flotsam in the river. And on a couple of occasions, one of his amphibians hit some of this stuff and destroyed the plane. So here was the ideal circumstance. And nobody was bothering him. There wasn't any air traffic down here, so they could conduct all these tests. And, it was a 15-minute flight to Philadelphia. So it just was an ideal. Fleet wings in the town of Bristol started to really grow. The engineering department grew. There were more employees out there. There still weren't a ton of them. They moved from 12 to maybe 20, 24. And, but all good things have to come to an end at some point. And the end here came in the form of unions. There was a union guy who was unskilled, had no trade. He wasn't a machinist, a tool die maker, or anything else. But he decided he was going to become the president of a he said, we came to work. The headlights, they smashed windshields, and they wouldn't let us in the factory. And this guy, John Doherty, was really tough. He was the president of the union and said, look, nobody comes to work unless all your employees join the union. And so Dad went in and talked to Carl and said, look, we got to do. What do you want? And Doherty gave Dad the demands that they wanted. Dad and Carl had a meeting, and then they made a decision, and my father delivered the decision to this guy Doherty. And years went by. Dad never told me what the deal was, because after Dad delivered the message to the Doherty, the union president, these thugs went away. And it turned out that what Carl offered Doherty was a new car. And it was an Oldsmobile, a Packard dealer in Bristol. And that was the deal. Doherty got a Packard, and the union problem went away. But it was clear to Dad and his partner, Tom Lavelle, that they couldn't continue like this because the union couldn't be trusted. And so remember, the deal that Carl had with his father was that the financing would continue until his father died. And then at one point, Carl's father died. And so then negotiations had to start to sell Fleet Wings. And at the time, Fleet Wings had developed this reputation of this secret company that had this high quality, skilled technology to fabricate and manufacture stainless steel. And the most important part of this was the concept of spot welding. And as a testimony to Carl's genius, when his senior thesis at MIT was to develop a timing device that timed the amount of electricity and the voltage that you could clamp down on some form of steel or copper and create a bond, a little spot. And that spot weld is something you see almost every day in your kitchen. You look at a pot, the handle's joined to the body of the pot, and you see two little dots on either side of the handle. That's a spot weld. And the ability to do that was figured out by Carl when he was a senior at MIT. And that's the technology that they used in this aircraft. And Henry J. Kaiser became aware of that, and he said, I want to buy this company. So as those negotiations went, 20 years older than my father, and he had a and work out a process engineering. My father was a mechanical engineer, and they just got along very well. There was almost a father-son relationship there. And so was a short guy. He was only about 5'4", and Dad was 6'1". So there was an interesting physical contrast there. And Tom said, well, we'll start the company, but it's got to have my name. Dad said, well, I guess we can do that, but I prefer we do something else. And Tom said, well, if we don't use my name, we won't do it. And so Dad was in his late 20s at the time, and he said, well, I'll go along with it. And they decided to go into business. So the question is, where do we do the business? There weren't any portions of fleet. Dad came to Newtown one day, and he saw this stocking works. And he went to the local hardware store and said, gee, look, this thing looks like it's abandoned. The windows are broken in it. It's all overgrown. You can see all these weeds growing around the fence. And there was a crack in the chimney there. And so the owner of the hardware store said, well, gee, that's the old stocking works, and it's in bankruptcy, and it's for sale. And the First National Bank of Newtown owns this. So Dad walked into the banker and introduced himself. And this is what we want for it. So Dad went back to Tom, and they discussed this, and they sat. And Grover said, I'll contribute to the equity of this new company. That's essentially where they got the core of the financing to start Lavelle Aircraft. And then they had relatives that were successful in other businesses. And so that was the source of the funding. So Dad went back to the banker and said, this is what we can afford to pay for the place. This is the deal. You guys take a mortgage. We can afford to pay you this amount of money. And that's the deal. And if you don't take it, don't ever call us again. This was on a Wednesday, and Dad and Tom had been living on their savings because they had left Fleet Wings at that point. Tom said, if we can't do a deal by Friday, I'm going back to Boston. So that was the alternative. And again, the bankers wanted all this interest and these penalties and all this stuff. And he said, look, you've owned this thing for years. It sat here. It's falling apart. Either take our deal or don't. So the bank sat down, the president of the bank sat down and called the board of directors in. I mean, this is a little business in a little bank in Newtown. It wasn't Chase Manhattan. There weren't all these big deals. Board of directors was 3 farmers. And they called him up and said, look, we got a deal. The farmer said, take it. And that was the way Lavelle started. And so they owned it for a year, and they spent a year renovating this thing. And that was 39. And they consummated the deal in 1940. And they spent the next year renovating the building so that they could use this thing. Because remember, it had been abandoned for several years, like 5-7 years. Nobody knew exactly how long. And so then the war started in 1941. And Lavelle's reputation as a first-class technical sheet metal manufacturing company was well known in the Department of Defense, Department of War at the time. And so their first major contract was the vertical stabilizer for the Curtiss C-46 Commando. And they built 1,700 of those things right here in Newtown. And one of the interesting aspects, do you have a picture? Yeah. Okay, so this is part of the stabilizer here, and there it is, right behind everybody. That's the Let's look at all the women. These, this is a little farm community. The farmers were busy farming. We're in the middle of a war. The country had been invaded, and everybody, whether it was a child, a wife, housewife, or a farmer, and the men that were in the service were all together to preserve and protect the country. It's the last time that this country has ever been united. Dad developed a training process to teach these women how to rivet. He designed jigs that they'd overlay the parts that had to be drilled, and these women would come and drill these things, and they taught them how to buck the rivets and how to rivet. And it turns out in the end that the best riveters were the women. But there was this sense of pride. They were protecting their country. And so this concept of pride and taking care of your employees was one of the core principles of Lavelle Aircraft. Sure, it was an incredibly advanced technical company with highly skilled people, but it was this concept of taking care of your people. You know, one of the concepts that you learn in officers candidate school are two basic concepts: mission focus and take care of your people. Those are probably the two core elements that made this company so successful over the years. And to that point, the concept that Dad had was to make a family. We want to get everybody working together. We want them to come to work and be happy every day. Somebody isn't happy, find out what's the matter with the guy. Talk to him. And so to that point, they formed a bowling league, a softball team. They had a gun club. They had trap, pistol, and rifle. And they had a choir. There were some women that were very talented, had very talented voices. And they provided professional recordings of the Lavelle choir. And during the Christmas season, for example, the choir would perform here in Philadelphia. So it was really a recognized professional choir. Another element of the company was during the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter. Every employee got a turkey. You put a free turkey from the tunnel hatchery. Didn't make any difference whether you were sweeping the floor or you were in the engineering department. Whatever size turkey you wanted in terms of weight, 5, 10, 20, whatever it was, put an order in, you got it. That was Thanksgiving, that was Christmas, and then at Easter, you got a ham. But it was this concept of taking care of the employees. And then at one point, the union decided that they were going to try to unionize Lavelle. And one guy started to bring this union concept into the plant, try to get that support. So then typically you have to have a vote. They had a vote, and the employees voted the union out. And there were only like 3 people that wanted the union. And the guy that was the leader that who thought he'd become the president of the union was ostracized by all the employees. Nobody spoke to the guy. They didn't do anything nasty to him. They just didn't speak to him. And then finally, the guy became so uncomfortable that he quit. But there was a harmonious business there. There was at one point in 1956 during the Hungarian Revolution. Into the country, do you have a job for them? And so Dad met with them and said, well, we may, but they have to have a skill. And so it turns out that there were 6 people that they brought in, 3 men, 3 women. 3 of the women were riveters. One of the men was a tool and die maker, and the other 2 guys were sheet metal mechanics. And that was in 1956. Those guys, all those 6 people worked at Lavelle until they retired at 65. And so there was a concept of this taking care of your family that's important. And if you don't remember anything else today, as you leave, I want you to think about this concept. It's called the RICH principle. And that acronym is spelled RITCH. Each one of those letters means something. The R stands for respect. The I stands for integrity. Every relationship personal or professional, contains those 5 elements. And if any one of those elements is missing, that speaks to the strength of the relationship. But this was a philosophy. My father never defined that. That was something that I figured out when I, heard about and grew up with this stuff. There wasn't a concept of Lavelle, oh, geez, there's the boss up here. Dad knew everybody. And he would teach a unit, and all of those rich principles were in play there all of those years. And in fact, when the plant was sold, some of the employees were ready to retire, and in 76, the company was sold, and the majority of the employees that started with Lavelle retired with Lavelle when the plant was sold. So they had that kind of a relationship. And then as time went on and these guys died, I took my father to the funeral of every one of those guys. There was that kind of loyalty there. This is something the country's never seen before. Those very words, concepts of principle, character, and integrity have gone out of our language today. You have to look for it if you can find it with a flashlight. It's just gone away. So these old school values built a company and they built a community. One of the things that they did, Lavelle did for the town, was to renovate the movie theater. Every Saturday night, the government provided these films to Lavelle of the different actions in the Pacific or in Europe. And they'd see these movies, but it brought this spirit. You had people in this little company working, and then everybody saw what they were doing when they went to the movies. Another company benefit was an annual picnic. The company rented the Willow Grove Park and rented it for the whole weekend, and all the employees could go there, do anything for free. Lavelle picked up the tab for the whole thing. But it was this kind of involvement and caring that paid off for the company. This is the kind of thing that built the caring. Every one of these parts that these women made, and as they drilled the holes and then put the Tico clamps in there before they riveted it, they cared about every one of them. And that's how you build that kind of care. And it was really genuine. So then back on the schedule of the events that happened, the company had this huge success during World War II, like many companies did. They had 700 employees. Lavelle was the largest employer in Bucks County at the time, and everything. Dad always said everything has to come to an end. In 1945, the war ended, and the government canceled these contracts immediately. Literally, there was no more work. These 700 people didn't have anything to do. They were busy on Friday. On Monday, there wasn't anything to do. So the company didn't lay off anybody. What they were thinking of, they were anticipating that the end of the war would come at some point. So what to do? So, as you drive through Bucks County at the time, they're all housing developments now. We lived in Yardley and Lower Makefield, and it was like a 20-minute drive down to the plant in Newtown, and we go down this Edgewood Road and till we got into Newtown, and there were farms, cornfields on both sides of the road. I mean, it was just like being out in Nebraska. And Dad was friendly with all these farmers, and I always had a lifelong interest in horses and dogs. And so he would take me into these different farms, and I'd get to see these horses and groom them. And but there was a standout thing that always caught my eye. And farmers have these elevators. How do they get the grain? Would cut the hay by hand, and then they put it on these hay wagons with these long pitchforks, and then take it in front of this hayloft. And then there was a claw-like device that would come down and on a pulley and pull this stuff up, and then they'd store it in the hayloft. And then that concept was labor intensive, and it was just brutal. And so then the farmer said, we're going to start baling this stuff. And the farm equipment companies like John Deere, for example, developed these balers. And then you still had to get those bales up into the hayloft, and they were doing it by hand. They put the bales on these wagons, and these guys would pick these things up. And, bales, horse hay, Timothy, comes in 40-pound bales and 60-pound bales. And, I was a kid, and I thought it was great. Dad would say, well, show them how strong you are. Pick that bale up and throw it up there. And that was great when I was 12, 14, and 16. But, when these guys were 50 or 60, it was a tough thing to do. And so then they started using these elevators, but the elevators were made of steel, and the elevators were huge. They were 16 or 20 feet long, and they'd leave them outside because they didn't have a place to put them in a barn. And so they'd use the elevators when? In the fall, when they were harvesting the crops. And so when they went to use the elevators, they're having been stood outside, they were all rusted. Things broke, and the farmers would spend days trying to get this thing going again. And so Dad had this concept that if we use aircraft engineering and aircraft materials, design an elevator, so if it breaks, they can unbolt the part and a farmer can repair it themselves, and we'll have the parts. And so that's how the farm division started, with this concept of building these elevators. And then there was another device called a wagon unloader, when they would put some of the hay mulch in these wagons. You had to unload it, and so they had this wheel at the end of the wagon that would turn, and it would spit this stuff out. And it would spit it into troughs, and the cattle would go and eat the forage out of the troughs. But that whole concept of the farm division was what they decided to move into, from airplanes to farm equipment, to keep this crew working. And I remember as a kid, we'd go to these different farm exhibits. They had them right here in Newtown. We'd go out to Quakertown. We went up to Canada. And some of the Lavelle aircraft conveyors wound up in Canada. They were all over the country. And so then that period of time where the defense was just shut down was supplemented by the farm division. And then the Korea started in 1950. And then the company was busy again. And that's the nature of a defense company. And we see that today. Eisenhower talked about the military industrial complex. These huge military contractors, Lockheed, Grumman, North American, they want wars every day, all year long, because that's their business. And that hasn't changed. Now they're making missiles that are expensive. They're making ammunition. And but this concept is that the defense companies don't have business unless there's a war. It's that simple. And so when the Korean War came, again in 50, from 50 to 53, and we were into a new area of aircraft, the jet engine, the jets. And Grumman, the first Grumman jet was the F7F Panther. And so the Lavelle was making parts for all these Grumman planes. And Lavelle was the primary subcontractor for Grumman. They made all parts for every Grumman plane from World War II, beginning with the F4F Wildcat, the F6F Hellcat, the F7F, the Tiger Cat, and then they moved into the amphibians, the Albatross, for example, and then they moved into the jets, the Panthers and the Cougars. In fact, if you go down to Willow Grove, they had a Panther out there for the longest time. So that, in fact, at Lavelle Aircraft, on the corner of the company lot on Sterling Street, they had a jet engine casing for an Allison J33 engine. And that was one of the projects that they made. Do you have a picture of that? Pardon me? Okay. I think it appears in an advertising brochure. It's a long cylindrical cone. Yes, there it is in the background there. So what you're looking at here on the left are these pile of cylinders. They're called the Herman Nelson heaters. You know, when in cold weather and on aircraft carriers, you have to preheat the engines before they can start. Well, Herman Nelson made this heater, and that's what those cylinders are there. And then those tall cylinders there, they're the casings for the Allison J33 engines, which powered the Cougar and the Panther, for example. One of those stood out on the corner. People would go by and say, geez, what the hell do they make in Lavelle Aircraft? So one day Dad said, we're going to put one of these things out there, and people are going to come in and say, what the hell is that? And it brought business into the company. And so these tubular frames right behind my father without the shirt on and Tom are engine mounts for the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, which was the engine for the TBF Avenger and the F6F Hellcat, and also the Tiger Cat, the F7F Tiger Cats. So they made all those engine mounts there. And then again, these on the right here, these are another form of these Herman Nelson heaters. And those little cylindrical tanks there are oil coolers for that R2800 engine. And that those oil coolers were also went on to the Chansport Corsair. Corsair had 2 air intakes on it that cooled 2 different parts of the plane. And that oil tank was part of one of the things that had to be cooled on it. And the same deal on the Pratt & Whitney 1340 engine, rated at 950 horsepower, had to have an oil cooler on it, and that was what they used on those things. And those 985s, that 450 Pratt engine was probably the most successful engine that Pratt & Whitney ever made. They put them on the Beavers up in Canada, and then after the war, they took these things off trainers, and the crop dusters used them to hang them on a Stearman. The Stearman. And then they could make these vertical maneuvers with all that weight and the dusters. So that's the application to that. And when people wanted to make the conversion of the Stearmans from the 220 Lycoming to this 450, they came to Lavelle and said, sell us one of your engine mounts so we can make the transition to on our Stearmans. But in that photograph on the lower left there, that's the whole view of that casing that you see inverted in this picture in the shop. And then right above that is the engine mount, and then that Herman Nelson heater is on top of that. So there's some of the things that they made at Lavelle, and every major airplane that Grumman produced, some significant part came out of Lavelle. And it came back, all developed, that whole relationship developed back in 29 when these guys were working for Grover Loaning. And they decided, Roy Grumman went out and started his own company, and he reckoned, geez, there were some smart engineers that were working for Grover, but Grover was a difficult personality, and these guys just didn't want to work for him anymore. And so everybody went their separate ways. And Lavelle, in the final analysis, was just a high-quality boutique aircraft component manufacturing company. And so with that reputation then grew as we got past the Cold War from 47 to 71. And then we got into the space race in 1957 when we were starting to make missiles and satellites, and the RCA Tyros weather satellites. They were made at Lavelle. RCA had the capability to make the photo equipment, but they didn't have the ability to make the metal part of the satellite. They came to Lavelle. But think about this. Some of these guys started out building planes in the late 20s, or the parts when they were kids out of trade school. And then they're march all these years forward, and they're building space components. These satellites that went up into space and ultimately went to the moon were being made by some of the people in Lavelle that were building these World War II aircraft for Grumman. Grumman built that those moon projects. So they came right out of Newtown. In fact, if you drive down Sterling Street today, you'll see a plaque out there that dedicates the Tyros, the history of the Tyros weather satellite being made right at Lavelle. You know, it's an office complex now, but there's a huge history in those buildings there, and that plaque memorializes that. So then we go through the 60s and we get into these the space program, and in 62 the Telstar communication satellite was built there. And an interesting thing happened in 1963. I remember Dad came home from work one day and he said, "Look at this. This is so exciting." And what he was showing me was a letter from the Secretary of the Air Force. It turns out that a C-46 had crashed in Burma during the war, and they couldn't identify the crew on the plane. And there were some mountain climbers that discovered the wreck, and they discovered the thing that was remaining in the wreck was the vertical stabilizer. And on the vertical stabilizer was a nameplate that said Lavelle Aircraft, Newtown, Bucks County, with a serial number on it. And they were able to, Department of the Air Force was able to significant part of a very small part of history, but it was very meaningful to the members of the family of that crew, because prior to discovery of that, nobody knew what happened to them. So then in 64, the Ranger images began transmitting, and the purpose of that, those Ranger images was to pick out landing spots for these different space vehicles. And so they did that, and Lavelle made some different parts for that, the antenna head and yoke for the lunar module. The most important thing that they made there relative to the space race were these lithium hydroxide canisters. And those, we started to hear about those in 1970 in the Apollo 13 program. What does the lithium hydroxide do? It removes the CO2. It's a filter. You know, on the spacecrafts, you have to get rid of the CO2 that the astronauts were breathing, and that's how they did it. But then a problem developed on the space station. Those lithium hydroxide canisters had two different forms. In the space station, that one was a rectangular shape, and the canisters on the spacesuits were cylindrical. So here are the astronauts in the space capsule, and the canisters had failed. What are you going to do? So again, Dad told this story, and it was so fascinating for me to hear that the call came into the plant, to the switchboard. They wanted to talk to some of the engineers, and so my father and the chief engineer at the time handled the conversation. And basically, what they told them was how to retrofit the cylindrical canister to the space capsule. And literally, if you could just imagine the engineering space up at Lavelle is a room about this size with these big drawing tables all over the place. And so then these guys brought some duct tape and some canisters that they had in the shop, the cylindrical ones and the rectangular ones, and they were playing with them, figuring out how can we make this transition. And so they figured it out with duct tape and some other things that they had on the space station so they could do it. And so that's how that problem was resolved. It was resolved right at Lavelle Aircraft here in Newtown. Then they make a movie about it, and Hollywood puts his spin on it, and it was unrecognizable. All of a sudden, it was the space engineers at the space station, were these geniuses that figured this stuff out, and they just didn't have the mechanical ability to do it. And that was the concept that Willie Messerschmitt had all those years ago, was that you could go to get a degree in any kind of engineering unless you had a mechanical skill. You had to be a sheet metal craftsman, or you had to be a tool and die maker. You had to understand the application of the thing that you were drawing on paper to how it was used on an airplane. And so that's why these guys were able to figure this stuff out. And that was the one of the milestones of this company, and it was just lost in time. Hollywood made it famous, and like everything that comes out of Hollywood, any relationship to reality is purely coincidental. And so this little historical society in Newtown is really a treasure of information. They've got one of those canisters there. I said to Dad one day, what are you going to do with this thing? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, well, look, the man that was the president of the Historical Society also owned the hardware store, and he's a fabulous guy. And I said, we ought to give this to Dave. And ultimately, that's what we did. And I personally gave it to Dave, and it's over there now. And if you have any intellectual curiosity about this thing, you need to go and see this thing, see how intricate this is. On the outside of the screen of this cylinder are these million little holes, that air could be absorbed into. And they developed a machine at Lavelle to punch all these holes in it, and they're a certain diameter, maybe they're a 1/16 of an inch of diameter, and then they're a 1/16 of an inch apart. I mean, it's a fabulous piece of engineering, and it's all made out of a special kind of steel, stainless steel, and it's spot welded. So all this technology that was developed at Fleet Wings back in the late at that time period, interestingly enough, when Lavelle completed the contract with RCA, they shipped these the Tyro satellites over there, and then RCA then went and hired away 3 guys that worked on this thing from Lavelle. And what a terrible thing to do. Here, these guys were all taken care of, and their families were taken care of at Lavelle. They go over to RCA, gives them some more money, and they just left. They didn't say, I'm going to give you 2 weeks notice. Picked up their check on Friday and said, we're gone. And so then RCA got done with the project. And guess what? They laid them off. Threw them away, just like scrap metal. They forgot the lesson that everybody else learned at Lavelle when the war ended. The whole purpose of the farm division was to protect everybody. And they did. And then when the Korean War started, everybody was back in business again. And then as time went on, everybody ages. It's good when wine ages, but it's not good when people age. And at 1976, all the original people at Lavelle were getting old. Dad was 64, I guess, at the time. Tom was 20 years older. And so a very difficult decision had to be made. So Dad talked to all the people that came on board with Lavelle at the beginning, said, how do you feel about this, guys? Do you want to work for a new company? And the majority of them said, no, we want to retire. So that was the decision that was made to sell the company was made with the employees, the original employees. So it was this concept of taking care of my men. What do they want to do? And so the majority of these guys didn't want to go work for the new guy. And what happened? The company was sold, and they worked for the new company till 1987. And then the new owner, who was an engineer, very smart guy, his focus was building sales, not so much taking care of people, but building the bottom line. And then he had an opportunity to move the whole plant to Philadelphia. There was a huge tax incentive. And he made the decision to move the plant to Philadelphia. But the one thing he didn't consider was the people. Do the people want to go to Philadelphia? And as these people age, where are you going to get the new guys? This is all very sophisticated stuff, high-tech materials that are being used. And ultimately, the company failed. Why? Because he couldn't get the employees. Nobody's learning the trades. And they literally just couldn't get people to come to do the trades, come to work every day. You know, like you had to be there at 8 o'clock and leave till 4:30. Well, some of these guys says, well, gee, we don't get up till 10 o'clock. Why can't the company start at 10 o'clock? And so ultimately the company failed, and it was sold again in 88, the following year. And the new owner, again, ran into the same problem. They just didn't have the connections with the military. You have to have connections with the military to run a successful business that's in the defense business. So finally, in 99, the company went into bankruptcy, and it was liquidated. So this history of this company with all these fabulous things in this story about taking care of the people and building this company and the town, preserving Newtown during the war years, was all lost. I walked down the main street in Newtown, I didn't recognize anything. Nobody ever heard of the Lavelle Aircraft. And I think that was a commentary of what's happening in the country today. Nobody knows about history or cares about it. And I think it's really a tragedy because you need something to care about and to fight for. But that's all gone away. So the story of Lavelle is really a story of a big family. And it brought a lot of good things to the people of Newtown. And it was the largest employer in Newtown for all of those years. And then when the company was sold, the place was renovated and changed, and it became an office complex, and that's where it is today. And so here's my father with that very canister that we were talking about, and that's Dad in that photograph to the right. And this was the Bucks County Advance was the paper, but that was a big piece of news, you know. And people in their homes could say, "Look, we worked on that. I made this or a part of this at the plant, and here it is in the plant." So there's this sense of pride that's gone away today. So there's a sense of intellectual fulfillment that came from this company, not only caring, taking care of people, providing the defense that we needed at the time in World War II and in Korea, but during the space race also. So this was a significant little company that's just really disappeared from all time in history. So then tomorrow, next week, next month is the rich principle. I think it's probably one of the most valuable pieces of information that is important to your everyday life. RITCH, respect, integrity, trust, communication, and humor. Every relationship has those elements, whether they're personal or professional. And they're like legs on a stool. If one of those elements goes away, the strength of the relationship goes away. So with that, folks, I'd like to thank you very much for coming here tonight. And I really am very happy to be able to share this story that I grew up with, because I think it's a significant one. So thank you again. And Eleanor, thank you. Yes.
And then transition to anyone else online.
Go ahead.
Have to repeat the question so the people online can hear.
Yeah. When they ask a question, if you can repeat the question.
Yes. Okay, well, why don't I do this? Why don't I hand you the microphone? And you just,
I don't have a question.
oh, you don't? Oh, I'm sorry.
Question, you have to repeat it.
Got it, got it. I thought you were going to have the magic question. So does anybody else have curious about something? Yes.
When it occurred, the song came out playing on the airways then on Telstar. I just gave a talk last week about Telstar and played the song to a group of veterans of the song. So it was really a big thing when it came out. You guys built that here, which is amazing.
Yes. Right. So then the comment was about the Telstar satellite that had a song written about it, and it became part of the vocabulary for a while. And probably few people knew what it actually meant, but it rhymed, and it was popular for a while. But it was right here in Newtown, Bucks County. Yes.
Was required for that they needed for any.
Okay, so there were two questions. The first one was, did any contractors come directly to Lavelle seeking a direct contract with Lavelle rather than going through a subcontractor? And the answer was yes. And typically the way that would happen would be that the contract with the prime contractor would run out, and then there'd be a time lapse, and that manufacturer would come, or that buyer would come and contact Lavelle and say, can you make some parts for us? And so it was in the capacity of making parts that the original vendor came back to the plant and said, can you make this or that for us? For example, on the DC-3, the DC-3 was the passenger version, the C-47 was the cargo version. And the principal difference between the two was a heavier floor in the C-47 plus stronger spars, to carry that extra weight. And so Arthur Godfrey happened to be a friend of my father's, and he had a DC-3, and he needed some parts made for the DC-3, and he came to my father, and they manufactured those parts for Godfrey's DC-3, and so there was a high celebrity example, but that's how the relationship developed. Okay, so what the question was there any form of equipment here in Johnstown that a contractor would have contracted with Lavelle for? And the answer is not to my knowledge. There could have been, but I'm not aware of it. And again, my awareness of all this would be Dad would come home, every night and say, gee, you should see this. I remember when they start to, there were some complex products that had compound curves in them. And how do you rivet these things? So they came up with explosive rivets so that you didn't have to buck the other side of the rivet. And so Dad said, look what we're doing. We're using these explosive rivets, and you put a heating iron on it, and that's what pops the rivet. And geez, I thought that was great. And Dad brought a whole bunch of those home. And then I drilled holes in logs. We had this great fireplace in the house. And so I drilled holes in the logs and put some of these explosive rivets in the logs. So my parents would be sitting there having drinks with friends, and then all of a sudden these rivets would go off. Bang, 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 you know. And so that was my application to explosive rivets. Sorry? No. They were just voluminous. And so I remember the at the time that the company was sold, again, those blueprints became the property of the new owner. And so what I did was preserve Dad's notebooks. And so as I go through this stuff, and I've got all the dates here that if I didn't remember them out of my head, I just looked in those notebooks. And there were different things that stuck in my mind, like the explosive rivets, for example. And there are just a bunch of little stories like that. But the part of the assets of the company, meaning the proprietary blueprints and the tools, became part of the assets that were sold and to the new company. So that's where that went. And then just on the subject of the conveyors, I have a younger brother, and he has a great interest in farm equipment. And we were just talking one day, and we said, geez, we ought to see if we can find a Lavelle conveyor. And so one day Pete called up and said, I found one. And so he bought this thing, and then we restored it. And it was exciting because Dad was still alive. He saw it. And then we were able to exhibit that in the Wrightstown Grange Fair. And that is in the Grange Museum now. But so there was an example of the conveyor that we were able to preserve.
Just a second. I wanted to open up the lines. If anyone online has any questions, please unmute yourself. Maybe not. I know there were a couple people that left, so. Yeah, absolutely. I've been kind of obsessed over the story of Lavelle and all of its contributions. So I'm glad that we were able to talk about Lavelle this evening. Actually, Arthur's going to be back in 2026 to actually talk extensively about the Seabird. So if you have interest in that aircraft, definitely come back. And I think it's September we have you slated for.
That Fleetwing Seabird is really a phenomenal story. And as I said, there were 7 of those planes built, and there's only one existing right now, and it's in a museum. But and that's the original one. And the reason that that's still existing was because it was actually crashed in Canada. And that was the prototype. And Carl Dagnall's father had a mining business in Canada, and they had an inexperienced pilot fly that thing, and cracked it up. And then an interesting guy that was the head of the trade school in Southern California that taught aircraft trades, sheet metal welding, things like that, found out about it, flew up to Canada, bought this thing, and then he brought it all the way to California. And one day Dad called up and said, you'll never guess what happened. There's this guy, his name is Channing Clark, and he bought the crashed Seabird, the F-101, and he's restoring it. And the reason that he called Dad was to get the technical information on how to restore this thing because it was all spot welded. They called that shot welding at the time. And this guy was teaching his students how to repair stainless steel, but he didn't know how to do this stuff. And so Dad had all the original drawings. Channing came here east, stayed with us in our house in Yardley, and they developed this relationship. And Channing was a wonderful guy. And then he rebuilt this thing, and the goal was to he flew it from California to Alaska where it was crashed, and then flew it back here, and landed it at 3M Airport back in the early 70s, and we all got to fly it. And so one of the great thrills that I had was flying the plane that my father was a co-engineer on, and taking this thing for a ride after all those years. And it was a great thrill, and also to see all these the skill and the engineering from a 1936 airplane that was applied to the aircraft industry through all these years. And as I said earlier, through pots and pans, the handle on a pot is fastened to that pot with a spot welds. And that Seabird, pardon me? And it's stainless, yeah. And then as there was an interesting, there's very few things that you could do today and even in the time without litigation. The Budd Company actually stole that spot welding design and employed it in their railroad cars. So that's how the stainless steel railroad cars, their manufacturing came. But it just one of the incredible inventions that has an everyday application to us. I mean, cars. Think about they're doing all this with robots today, shot welding. But anyway, Channing rebuilt this thing, and I got to fly it, and it was really an exciting experience. That was one of the real thrills of my life. And then Bill Engel was the second test pilot on this thing, and then he came and he flew it, and I actually got to be the pilot in command, and I thought that was a great thrill. And then Bill was sitting right next to me, and Bill was like a Chuck Yeager. I mean, he just was flew all these early planes, talked about the spin test, and it was just a fascinating guy to spend a couple flights with to learn about these things. And we actually did a spin test in a Seabird, so it was just a great feeling. I got to tell you, I was scared to death. I mean, that is not a it's a handsome plane when it's on the ground and flying. But when all of a sudden you start pulling the power back, and just before it breaks, and then one wing goes off, and you go down and you kick the rudder, and then that thing starts to rotate, that was a thrill, let me tell you. And then recovering from it was equally exciting, because you saw the engine on that thing is all braced, and I just, you had to do it. Bill said I did it in 1936. And he climbed all through the plane and said, Channing rebuilt this thing just right. And so we did it. And it was the only thing we didn't do was land on the Delaware River. And the reason that we didn't was because we were afraid that we might hit some flotsam, because at that point, all these freighters were coming up to the steel mill, and there was just a lot of trash in the river. And so it was just too much of a risk to take. It's been sold 3 times, and it's in a museum in Texas right now. So and I saw it when it was sold, and like Channing, I think was probably just 80 when he sold the thing, and he sold it to a guy that just sold his computer company and just had gobs of cash, and he loved airplanes, and so he knew about this and he bought it. And I flew down to the Sun and Fun air show and met the guy down there, and had a nice time talking about Seabirds. And I have the complete record, engineering drawings and photographs of the Seabird. And I can say without hesitation or reservation, there isn't anybody that has a more complete record of that airplane than I do. And it came from my father, and so I retain that. And those pictures that you saw tonight were all part of that collection. And all those photographs were professionally taken with a 4x5 Graflex, and I've got all the negatives. So they're just it was just the seabird was a wonderful story.
And you can hear more about it next year. Yeah, that's why I put the slide back up, and I was just to answer your question about NADC. The predecessor to NADC, there was some contribution to the Brewster Buffalo from Lavelle. Yeah, yeah. Hopefully, Lavelle got paid. Yeah. Well, listen, I know we're running a little long this evening, but I think it's all right because it's a fascinating story. I want to thank anyone left online and folks here this evening, and hopefully this was an enjoyable presentation just to commemorate Veterans Day. And I think you can appreciate the reason why I wanted to have this talk this evening is because of Lavelle's contributions to the war effort and the broader community. And it's a story that I think needs to continue to be told. And, you know, as was mentioned, if you have interest in seeing some Lavelle artifacts, the Newtown Historical Society, right there in downtown Newtown, does have a collection that you can see. So definitely that's worth your time. And also, I think some of your dad's records are at the Grundy Library. Is that correct?
They have duplicates of those at Newtown, and the Grundy Library is really a wonderful place. Joe Grundy was a U.S. senator, and he owned the Grundy mills that made fabric and or wove fabric, and the thrust of that was used for uniforms in World War II. And that was the other large industry in Bristol. So if somebody didn't work at Fleet Wings, they worked at Grundy. And Joe didn't have any children. He had a sister. And so when she died, he bought one of the big houses on Radcliffe Street and converted that into a library. And it's really quite a wonderful facility. In fact, as you sit in that, the main floor of the library, there are two levels, a street level, and then you go down some stairs and you sit on this ground level, and you open these glass sliding doors and you're right out on the Delaware River. I mean, it's really quite spectacular. And whenever I can, I bring something to read and like to be able to sit down there and look over the river. In fact, the original Fleet Wing site was destroyed. It's now a housing development and a bunch of condos out there. They tore down the hangar and the ramp, and so all that's all gone away. And the only part of the Fleet Wings Corporation that remains is the office building. It's a brick, I think it's a 3-story structure on Radcliffe Street. So that was remaining, the remains of Fleet Wings.
All right, thank you. Well, I think this one wonderful presentation. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. And I'm so glad we're able to talk a little bit about the contributions of your dad to the local community. And it's a story that I think needs to continue to be told.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to tell.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So I think we're going to wrap things here this evening. Just a quick reminder for anyone who's left online and folks here, we do have a webinar next week. So a week from now, we actually have a gentleman who spent time on a ballistic submarine, a nuclear submarine during the Cold War. And he has agreed to talk about life aboard the submarine. So really looking forward to it. I've seen a preview of his presentation. Looks really fabulous. So please join us at our usual time, 7:30 next week. And then in December, we will have another live program here to round out the year. Art Horbach is going to come and talk about sonobuoys. So hopefully you can join us for both programs. So thanks again, and we will call it an evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
Is that the guy that gave a talk? Sonobuoys a few years ago?
It is.
Was that on the veterans? Yeah. That doesn't matter. Okay.